Hello, my name is Tia Oso. I'm a principal with the ZEAL Cooperative. We're partnering with the Borealis Racial Equity and Journalism Fund to present to you Infinite Patterns, a kaleidoscope podcast. This podcast explores the infinite perspectives shaping and transforming the field of journalism. I'm super excited to be digging into today's topic, which is strategies for dismantling systemic inequities in news coverage with our panel of guests. We're going to be in conversation with each other who are also grantees of the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund and leaders transforming the field of journalism today. Our guests on today are Damaso Reyes with New York Amsterdam News, Luella Brain with 4 Points Media, and Crystal Good with Black by God. I'm your host, Tia Oso, principal member of the ZEAL Cooperative, where we are helping to create spaces for independent artists to thrive. Thank you all so much for joining me on today. This topic is so important. When we're talking about strategies for dismantling systemic equities in news coverage, we understand, or my understanding, I should say, speaking from my own perspective, is that the field of media justice talks about the roots of mainstream journalism in the United States really being rooted in patriarchal and white supremacist frameworks, where often news media and news coverage was used and has been used to sensationalize, to stoke racism and division, or even patriarchy, to advocate against policies and the humanity of others. There are studies that have shown, from example, the Color of Change organization, that the ways that the news media covers different topics contributes directly to racial discrimination against Black families, or painting over representing African Americans as the perpetuators of crime in our society. It's really important that we understand not just the ways that the news covers our different topics, but the social implications for that coverage and the ways that the authoritative voice of the media, right, helps to shape our society. So I'm really, really grateful to be in conversation with the three of you on today about this topic. And I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves by way of answering what interests you about helping to dismantle, right, and create, right, news coverage that is more equitable by dismantling and addressing the systemic inequities in news coverage on today. And I would like to begin with Luella.
Hi, I'm Luella Bryn. I'm a Apsalaga woman living on the Crow Indian Reservation in southeastern Montana, and I run 4 Points Media. For me, journalism is really the natural evolution of what our people did before colonization. When we would tell our stories of our great victories, of our great defeats, of interacting with each other, there always had to be a witness. There always had to be someone to corroborate that story. And if there wasn't, people wouldn't tell those stories. And for me, like, journalism is the evolution of that practice. You have to have corroboration, you have to have witnesses, you have to have people who say, yes, that did happen. And it tied so nicely together that for me it just felt like the career that made sense for me in how I view the world as an Apsalaga woman. And going to journalism school and kind of learning history and the role that journalism played, it was a wake-up call, because you do learn all of the negative things, and then working in mainstream journalism in my community and in my region, there is distrust, and that's something that we battle at 4 Points Media. Like, we're seen as traditional mainstream journalism, even though we only cover the Crow Reservation. We only hire Indigenous writers. We're all Indigenous. Our board is primarily Indigenous people, or non-Indigenous people who cover Indigenous issues. people still see us as outsiders because we call ourselves journalists. And that is because of the harm that journalism has done in our community. And that idea of parachuting in and taking stories and leaving and never offering solutions or never getting to know the community or never building relationships in the community. So we really have to kind of work backwards. Like we have to introduce ourselves to the community that we grew up in and be like, hey, trust us. You know us. You grew up with us. We're not here to steal stories in the way that other people have done. We're here to tell your stories, to help you tell your own stories. And it's a real struggle for us to do that. And we've been publishing since November 2021. And we've gotten a pretty good amount of news. But we've missed out on a lot of stuff because people don't trust journalism.
Wow, how powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I just want to lift up the Indigenous perspective around there being a witness, right? And storytelling being in history recording, right? Being a community process, a communal process. And then this idea around you having to reintroduce and establish trust with journalism and with media, with your community because of those historic wrongs that have happened. Damaso Reyes, New York Amsterdam News, please introduce yourself once again to our listeners and your perspective and your interest in this topic around strategies for dismantling systemic inequities in news coverage.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm Damaso Reyes. I'm the executive editor at the New York Amsterdam News. And I think I have maybe a little bit of a different perspective because our news organization was founded over 100 years ago in 1909. And part of the reason why we were founded, like so many other Black news organizations previously and since, is to provide a different perspective and a different voice, to provide a counterweight, one might say, to mainstream news. It's interesting hearing Luella's perspective because I think our readers very much see us as part of the community. They know, not that our community is monolithic, but I think by and large in our interactions with the community, they see us as part of them, in part because we have over 100 years of history of defending and advocating for our community. And so when many other news organizations would portray our community in a bad light or in a negative light, the Amsterdam News could reliably be depended upon to provide a different perspective, a more holistic perspective. Speaking personally, I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, in the 1980s. And when I read coverage of my community in some of the mainstream newspapers, it was almost always unfailingly negative. And it didn't reflect what I saw around me as a young person, people going to church, kids playing, block parties. Were there drugs? Yes. Was there violence? Yes. But it was the exception to our experiences as human beings, not the rule. But if you read coverage in the Daily News or the New York Times or the New York Post, what little coverage you read of my community was almost always about violence, about drugs. And so one of the things that prompted me to become a journalist was the idea that I wanted to provide a different perspective. I wanted to provide a more holistic and realistic perspective because as a member of my community, I could say, well, yes, there is violence, but there's also another experience that is the majority experience of us, which is people going to work, people going to church, people playing, people raising families that don't have anything to do with these negative things. So for me personally, and I think for our news organization, representing our community in a more holistic and nuanced way is really central to our mission and to our perspective. And if we were going to have a news media in this day and age, which is fighting for the attention of people, young people especially, who have lots of other choices in terms of getting information. And notice I use the word information, not news, getting information, right? You have a lot of competing interests for your attention. So why should people read, watch, listen to what we call the news if that isn't representative of their experiences, of their understanding, if the people creating the news aren't representative of the communities that they are based in or that they claim to cover? This has been a longstanding problem in mainstream media, where going back to over 50 years ago with the Kerner Commission report, we understood that a lack of representation and diversity in the media exacerbated division within our society, and yet the vast majority of mainstream news organizations are not representative of our country. They're not representative of the communities they're based in. And they've had decades to remedy that. And so, one of the things about working and being a leader at a news organization that serves a community of color, that's made up of journalists of color, is that we don't have that problem. We are diverse. We do represent our community in ways in which mainstream media, I'm going to say, has chosen not to, because after a certain point, when you don't hit certain goals, when you don't make certain changes, it's a choice, whether it's conscious or subconscious. These news organizations have failed, and that failure doesn't seem to bother them enough to actually make a decisive transformation. And so part of our goal as a news organization very much is to hold them accountable and hold up a mirror to them to say that, hey, there's a different way of seeing the world and a different way of representing it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Damaso. So many points that you lifted up is, number one, your organization is over 100 years old, Black media organization serving Black communities, and, created, right, and developed in the fires of, racial discrimination and stratification. And so you've established that trusted community, but also holding the perspective of mainstream journalism, holding those organizations to task, because at this point, there's not, legalized racial discrimination the way it was 100 years ago. And yet our newsrooms, corporate newsrooms especially, are often led by and controlled by white men. And the conversations around diversity, the myriad reports that have come out, to your point, that point to the importance of diversity, the ill social effects and impacts of, narrow and non-inclusive coverage, and yet they've chosen not to, right, change their ways. And that's the importance of both the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, in addition to supporting your organization, but also helping to reshape, right, journalism in the way that is necessary to combat the ill effects that we feel from that our society, that actually are impacting our society adversely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Crystal Good, we are down to you for the introduction. Please introduce yourself and your organization and why this topic is so interesting and important to you in the work that you do.
My name is Crystal Good. I'm the founder and publisher of Black by God, the West Virginian. We center Black voices in Central Appalachia. Just by existing, we are challenging what this question means and how we can redefine it. And I say that knowing that West Virginia, Black by God, stands in the legacy of Black papers that have existed in Central Appalachia and West Virginia since the 1800s. And sometimes, I was so happy to hear Luella talk about witness, because we have a folk reporters program, and our folk reporters program asks people to do one thing, and that is be a witness. Folk Reporters is centering citizen journalism, and we're asking our readers to go to public meetings, to cover those in however they want to, right? So we're kind of breaking down the big J and the little j, right, in the journalism world, right? And asking citizens, if you attend a public meeting and you have social media and you have an audience, we're asking you to report what you heard in that city council meeting, to report what you heard in that public service commission. And we ask people to do it in a format that they're comfortable with. Some people might want to do a Twitter thread. Some people might want to do a Facebook post. Some people might want to do a video. And through our Folk Reporters program, we call it witness, right? We just want people to bear witness because we know that when you go into a room, you will change it, especially if you are a brown, black, or person that is not over 50 white man in most of these spaces, right? That just your presence alone can change something. And let me tell you, if you have this, or you have a computer, or you have a pen, people will be paying attention. So I'm very proud of our Folk Reporters program. It's going along, chugga. But, I really enjoy bringing in citizens to the journalism conversation. And Damaso, I was so thankful that you mentioned the Kerner report because that's such a key element, right? That so many people, so many news editors and journalists have never read. They just haven't been presented with that information. And so Black by God, we're partnering up with News Futures for October to host a meeting. And we will be hoping to educate our fellow journalists and citizens around the Kerner report and a lot of the things that you've read in Media 2070, which is a fantastic white paper that I really encourage people to read. One of the things, with Black by God that I'm proud of is how our stories are having an impact. And I know that they're having an impact because of three things. One, when we wrote a story about February 4th being West Virginia's Emancipation Day, basically West Virginia got an asterisk in the Emancipation Proclamation. And the asterisk said that West Virginia, a state that seceded from Virginia, as the myth is told, that we wanted to not have slaves. But somehow we got an asterisk in the Emancipation Proclamation that said we could keep enslaving human beings until a certain date. So the West Virginia legislature did not ratify or free enslaved human beings in West Virginia until after the Emancipation Proclamation on February 4th. And so Black by God wrote an article about this last year and very proud that this year during the West Virginia legislature, they recognized February 4th, 1865 as West Virginia's true Emancipation Day. Now, this is not new news, right? This is from 1865 and it's 2024 and we're bringing forth this message because it's so important that, we track history. And so the second thing I'm really proud of with Black by God is that we are just creating a record. Like you said, Tia, it's about a record. And one of the things that I stand so proud on and know how the power of the Black press. When the Stonewall Jackson statue was dedicated, and it sits on West Virginia's Capitol lawn, and I believe that was in the early 1900s, that the way that the white papers covered it was very, very different than the way that the Black papers of the time recorded it. And just by chance, our library actually happens to have those articles on microfiche, and you can see plain as day the very difference, right? So imagine if history only had that one archive, right?
Right.
And then there's another archive, which at least puts some doubt into historians and the future minds of what actually happened since there's such a discrepancy. And so Black by God in the legacy and the tradition, right? And the Amsterdam paper, of course, legend there, that if we're recording, maybe that's enough. If we're documenting, maybe that's enough because like Luella, I never feel like I'm doing enough. I'm missing stories and this and this and this, but I just get peace that we're documenting and we're creating a record. And I think that's what we're supposed to be doing. And as far as changing the way that the media ecosystem is and the journalism culture in West Virginia, one of the things that we've asked our friends and allies and fellow nonprofit newsrooms and things is to diversify your sources, right? Something as simple as when you write a story, if it's a Black story, people are going to go out and interview Black people, right? And they're usually probably going to pass that to the Black reporter in the newsroom, right? If there happens to be one, right? But what we're asking is that anybody writing any story, consider diversifying your sources. Consider making sure that you have diversity in those sources. If you're writing a story about COVID, you can find a Black doctor to talk to. You can find a Black nurse. You can find professionals in the field. They exist. And so often what I found in small towns and small states like West Virginia, right, people kind of tend to gravitate to who they know and somebody that they know and that they know. And so really my call to action for so many reporters is to diversify your sources. You can seek BIPOC people out, professionals otherwise, to interview for your story. And I've noticed a small change in my community in that. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud that because Black by God exists, some other newsrooms and their reporters will reach out to Black by God and want us to review a story, or it might have a question, right, about the phrasing or something, or could I do this better, because they don't have the editorial support in their newsroom, right, to ask those questions too. So I feel very fortunate that people feel comfortable with Black by God, and we're building a conversation, both exterior and interior, in the journalism and media community about how do we really center, right? Like, why does a newspaper like Black by God have to exist? And, what is everybody's responsibility in and around that? And, so far, I'm very proud. We started Black by God in 2020. We're still chugging along. And, that to me alone, if you think about it, a Black newspaper in Central Appalachia, that alone is probably, it's a little mind blowing to me, because I know how deeply we are supported. We're supported. And I say this, I call it the rings of influence. So inside Black by God, we're accountable to 65,000 Black folks. That's the heartbeat, right? And then out from that, our rings of influence are really the expatriates of West Virginia, people that came to college or people that grew up in West Virginia and they've gone off to Colorado or San Francisco or Tibet, right? And so they're very interested in hometown stuff, right? They still care because that's where they're from. And then out from that, Black by God has been developing an audience of people just like yourselves, of people in media, people that want to talk about the news, people that want to share, tidbits and things about how to run a nonprofit newsroom or how to run a social enterprise newsroom. And so I'm very proud of that. And then inside there somewhere, I call it the good white liberals are threaded through there. And we're thankful for them as our advocates and our allies and our donors. But to me, it's very surprising that Black by God has such a robust and diverse audience. I don't think people are imagining that when they think of a small Black newspaper in Central Appalachia. But we have a diversity of readers, and that has been the most surprising thing. And I'll close out by saying, the proof is in the pudding. Black by God is delivered. We do a print and we're online also. And the reason we do the print is because, as you can tell, that the Wi-Fi is somewhat challenging in West Virginia. So I don't want to ask families that are already overburdened to try to find some Wi-Fi so you can read my story.
Thanks so much, Crystal, for sharing. So exciting to have the various perspectives, both from newer organizations, but are in the longstanding tradition, and then the OG, like New York Amsterdam News, for this conversation. One of the things that, and Crystal, you already started kind of digging into some of the strategies, right, around dismantling the inequities in news coverage. I want to ask both Damaso and then Luella actually to share about the reasons why we need to do that, and some of the ways that we see inequities in news coverage come up for the communities that you're serving, and why it's so necessary for your media outlet to not just exist, but to be pushing against, right, the things that mainstream media have been doing, right, that are adverse to our communities. And I'm asking Damaso for you to start, because you told a personal story both about the news coverage as you were growing up, and then this institution that the New York Amsterdam News is.
Sure. So I think the very first and primary and most important inequity in news coverage is lack of coverage, right? So if we think about the way that mainstream organizations cover communities of color, often it's a lack of coverage that we see. So one of the things that I talk to donors about is that, we operate in New York City, which is the media capital of the world. But for Black and brown folks, they live largely in a news desert, because the large media institutions that are based in New York City don't cover their communities, or don't cover their communities with the same kind of depth that they cover white communities. And so that's the very first and I think most important thing that we do as a news organization, is we cover issues and topics and parts of our community that will never get covered anywhere else. So at least a few times a month, I get emails from people asking me, oh, I'm researching this person or a member of my family, and they were mentioned in your newspaper 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, because we were the only people covering our community. So we become a historical record, and that's incredibly important. The other part is that when it comes to dealing with inequity, is that if we're going to have a multiracial democracy, if that's going to survive this election in the fall and survive into the future, then that means that we need informed citizens. We need citizens who feel like they can find reliable sources of information that are going to tell them not just what they want to know, but what they need to know in order to be engaged, in order to keep their communities safe, and to make good choices for their community. And that's where having diverse sources of information and sources of information that actually represent the community is incredibly important. And this is, I think, what we're struggling with. So one thing that I think we very much see is that when people don't see themselves reflected in coverage, when they see their communities covered in ways that don't align with what their lived experiences, then people tend to tune out. People tend to disengage from news. And that's incredibly dangerous, right? If we're going to have a multiracial functioning democracy, information is the heartbeat of that. And if you're not getting information, then you are really at the whim of whoever can do the best job of manipulating you, whoever the best, loudest, slickest demagogue is. And I think we have seen that happen in this country in ways that a lot of people weren't expecting or weren't understanding. And if we don't have a news media that represents the full scope and scale of our incredibly, wonderfully diverse country, then how can we hold powerful people and institutions accountable? If we don't know what's going on, if we don't understand the inequity because we're not part of those communities, if we, as journalists, then it's really hard to say, hey, there's a funding inequity here, or there's an over-policing inequity happening, because if you've never been stopped and frisked, I've had conversation with good-hearted white liberal friends about stop and frisk. And, I sat there in the stop and frisk trial, 10 plus years ago, and hearing people's testimony saying, yeah, I've been stopped, 50 times. Every time I go see my mother in the housing project I grew up in, I would be stopped. If you never have that experience, then, it's like, well, okay, people get stopped, and, that's just the price that we have to pay as a society in order to have safety. Well, if you are never paying that price, then it becomes an abstraction, right? And so much of inequity and injustice around the world, as we're seeing currently, and certainly in our country, comes down to it doesn't impact me. And if you are a journalist and it doesn't impact you, it doesn't impact your family, then again, it becomes an abstraction that maybe you write about, maybe you don't, maybe you write fleetingly about, but it's not part of the core of who you or your community are. So you can treat it like an abstraction because it doesn't affect you in a way that's personal. And, as much as, many mainstream journalists still like to cling to this idea of objectivity, journalists are people. We're citizens too, right? And our lived experience informs the way we see the world, and the way we see the world informs how we do our reporting. Our goal should not be to be objective. Our goal should be to be fair. And sometimes being fair means that we have to call out injustice. It's a lot harder to do when it's an abstract thing than when you or members of your family or members of your community have that lived experience, which is why having diverse news organizations is so critically important. Because again, to go back to what we said earlier, it's been 50 years, well, more than 50 years since we've known about the inequality and injustice that the news media portrays, but 50 years plus since the Kerner Report laid it out in black and white. We've had more than a generation to address this, and mainstream news organizations have not prioritized it. And I'm happy to have that conversation with the editor of any news organization that wants to have the debate. And at a certain point, we have to recognize that is a sin of omission or commission. And so, one of the things that we did in our news organization is we founded the first investigative unit at a Black newspaper. Why? Because I don't want to have to depend upon partnering with a larger white-led news organization to have that capacity to report about my community in depth. I want to build that power in my community with journalists from my community. And a lot of people thought it was something that, was a good idea, but impractical. And here we are, more than 2 years later, having won a number of awards, but more importantly, done really impactful journalism, which is serving our community. And so having news organizations of color provide platforms for journalists of color is more important now than I think it ever has been.
Yeah, thank you so much, Damaso. You touched on so many key points there around there being coverage at all, and then whether or not that coverage is fair. And then the perspectives, right, of many mainstream journalists having a level of detachment because it's not a part of their lived experience, nor a part of their community's experience. And it just highlights to me when you talk about stop and frisk, it made me think about the Central Park Five, which are now, the exonerated five, and the way that the New York Police Department and the New York Times and the collusion between the mainstream media and the police, right, to paint this picture of what happened and then using it to enact policies, right, supporting tough on crime policies and things like stop and frisk.
And just to touch on that very briefly, back when that trial was happening and Donald Trump was taking out full-page ads in New York City media calling for, the conviction and worse of these five men, the Amsterdam News was one of the few, if not only, news organizations saying, hey, this is a rush to judgment. We need to be more thoughtful about this. And now the exonerated five, one of those five is now a New York City council member.
Yeah.
But if you just read the coverage of the New York Post or the New York Times or the Daily News at the time, these young men were convicted even before the jury was impaneled, if you had read that coverage. But that's why having a counterpoint, having another news organization that was saying, this doesn't seem right, what's happening to these young men. And ultimately that was proven right, as it has been proven right about so many wrongfully convicted young men and women and others who later go on to be exonerated, sometimes sadly after they have been executed by the state.
Yeah.
This is why we need a diverse media.
Yeah. Yeah. Luella, share with us what are the ways that systemic inequity shows up in news coverage for your community and the reason why 4 Points Media is so important.
Wow. In my lived experience, Indigenous people in Montana are broken into two groups in the news, and that's criminals and performers. So it's really mugshots and feathers, right? We're either dancing at powwows or we're in the crime section. And when I worked at a local county paper, we increased coverage of the Crow and Northern Cheyenne community because that's primarily who we were who was in our county. And sales went up, advertising went up, subscriptions went up, and I got pushed back. So much pushback from my bosses because quote, "This is not a tribal paper." Regardless of whether or not we were making more money, they didn't want that, the stigma of being a tribal paper. And we made a ton more money. We were supporting a whole nother paper because of the increase in coverage. And close to 80% of the county that we covered is either on the reservation, Crow Reservation, or Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And but there was that pushback, and it got so bad that that's the reason I quit that job and started 4 Points Media. When I worked in Billings at a large regional paper, I covered small communities for a weekly section, so it was like I was working for a weekly paper. But whenever there was like a native story, they would want me to do it, because they didn't know how to engage. And it's one of the longest running papers in the state, and they still don't know how to engage. At that point, they didn't know how to engage with their native communities. And I finally had to tell them, I'm related to so many people. I can't be fair in my coverage. So they took me off of the native beat. But it was so frustrating because whenever they had a native question, like they would ask me, and it would be about Northern Cheyennes, or it'd be about Assiniboines, or it would be about Crees, and I don't know anything about them. Those aren't my people. But this pan Indian attitude of like we're all the same.
All Indians. You an Indian? What?
Yeah, we're all the same. We all know each other's culture. We all do the same thing, and it's like, no, in fact, we're all very ethnocentric, and we're all very much allergic to the other's culture and practices. And we know about our people and maybe a little bit about someone else's, but not enough to make a judgment on anything. And we can't speak for the entire native population of Montana. And every newsroom I've worked in, I would have to speak for the entire native populations in Montana. And I've worked in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mainstream newsrooms in Montana. And that was the biggest struggle for me, was like learning how to say, no, I can't answer that question. I don't know. Call this person, they might know. Call that person, they might know. Go over there and ask them. They'll tell you. Now, the people running the large regional paper that I worked for now, that it's a whole different story, but these smaller communities are still struggling. The TV stations are still struggling because they've cut back on full-time staff so much that they're run basically by interns, right? And the interns come from all over the place. They don't know anything about Indigenous people. They don't know anything about Montana tribes. They don't know anything about the tribes in the region that they're covering. And there was improvement over the last 10 years. There was so much improvement in coverage of our communities. And since all these cutbacks, and I'd say the last 4 years or so, it's reverted back to what it was. And it's powwows and crime again. And it's like, that's the default setting. No matter how much progress is made, any disruption in the ecosystem, we go right back to the default setting. And it's important for 4 Points Media to exist, to, at least for the Crow people at this point, to be that place for even the simplest things like school closures. because we don't even get that. We are there to write stories about even positive things, like so-and-so's kid graduated from Marine boot camp, right? The preschool graduation in Lodge Grass, or the high school graduations, the all these kind of small town news things that don't make the regional paper, that don't make the TV station. There'd be no coverage for them otherwise. And we have a readership of about 7,000 to 8,000 a month, but our tribal membership is only 14,000. So half of our population is reading, but most of our readers are people who don't live on the reservation anymore. Mm-hmm. So it's those people who have moved away, who want to know what's going on at home. And for me, like that's a huge victory. Is there's a place now for those people to get news, to get information, where they're otherwise they'd have to scroll Facebook for 14 hours a day to get all of that information. So it's important for us to kind of fight those stereotypes of that default news setting, to provide community news for people who want to still feel like they're part of our community, and for people who actually still live in the community.
Amazing. Damaso, Crystal, wanted to ask if you have anything to share in response to the perspectives that were lifted up, in by way of closing us out for this conversation, just at this juncture, because we're on limited time. What I heard around both the challenges, but then also some of the solutions and strategies, is that your organizations and the work that you're doing is serving as a community archive. You're serving as a resource to other media outlets. You are also establishing and building bases of power in your communities. I want to ask you to share a reflection from the conversation in lift up another solution around dismantling systemic inequities in news coverage. And we can start with you, Crystal, Damaso, and then we'll close with.
Oh no, another strategy. I don't know. I feel that I'm excited about this conversation and more conversations with small publishers and Black publishers, because what my goal is to get Black by God's content to be able to bubble up into a national conversation. We are part of Black culture. We are a part of African American culture, and that should mean something, right? So I'll be excited when Black by God is getting content that can bubble up, right? And I can start to share some of the beautiful stories and break down some stereotypes of what people may or may not think about Black folks living in the mountains. So that to me feels really important as a strategy. And that's just networking. But this is hard work as a small publisher. So, I think one of the things that is, part of the solution of this problem is funding. And that is really bringing in resources to small publishers and people trying to do the work, because it's I don't want to say it's not easy, but we all know, like Willa said, that trust is important. And for me, Black by God, it's not just building trust with readers and helping people bring them into into Black by God as citizen journalists, or understand that this paper is for and by us, but it's also to build trust within Black journalists who have left the industry. So Black by God works with 4 reporters, each one television, one radio, several different venues, and they all left the industry. One left because she was, she couldn't wear her natural hair on the television news, right? Another one left because, they wanted her to cover Black stories, but then wouldn't let her cover We heard this so many times during 2020 George Floyd, right? Like, you can't do that. And so Black by God's able to work with reporters that have gotten out of the industry. But the challenge is we're so underfunded that, you can only work with Black by God as part-time, as volunteer, as something. And because there's not a lot of trust, because we don't have funding. So I can't ask anybody to come work full time or give as much energy as I do, because that's not there. But fingers crossed, I'm really hopeful. I'm sure all of you all are aware of the funding cycles and things that are going on in this country around news and media. Of course, a prime example, we're all here as grantees. But to me, I will have much more ease in our ability to make a difference, right, around racial equity in journalism, when Black by God's able to, hire full-time staff and they know that they're going to get their paycheck on Friday. And, wouldn't it be great if we start something now and I could actually offer a retirement to somebody? Because my dream with Black by God is that we will publish, right? We have writers that are as young as 14, high school students that submit. And my goal is that Black by God will, create, we will be the first place that you publish your story as you go on in life and be successful. And so with that, I really see us as a catalyst. And to me, that is part of the strategy. Sometimes it's really just like moving the ball just a little bit down, a little bit down, a little bit down. So I give myself comfort in that. And I'm really excited to hear from my fellow publishers and editors what their solutions are. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't think there's, just one solution. And I think there's a lot of solutions, and I think there are a lot of solutions that we haven't thought of yet. But one thing I think is incredibly important is that we come together as journalists serving communities of color and find ways to support and uplift each other, to form kind of mutual aid societies, whether it's with funders and introducing each other to funders that we might not individually have access to forming, publishing alliances where we can distribute each other's information content and find ways for us to collaborate on issues that, affect our different communities in different ways, but are important. I think that we need to do a lot more collaboration, not just with our readers and the communities we serve, but with each other as journalists, because there's a lot of knowledge that we have that tends to get siloed. We figure out a solution to a problem and then, we implement it, but we don't necessarily share that information with our colleagues who might be facing similar problems. So I think there's a lot of power in our community. And I think we need to work even harder to find ways that we can amplify each other and amplify the communal power that we have. I think one of the things that patriarchy and white supremacy does incredibly well is that it isolates us. It silos and atomizes us. And that's part of the way that they try to diminish us because, according to the census, we will be the majority very, very, very soon. But we don't have the majority of the power. We don't economically, politically, or socially. And so by coming together and refusing to be divided, I think we can begin to exercise that power that we have.
Yeah, it's amazing. Luella, reflections and on the solutions.
One of the kind of solution-y things that we're working on right now is a style book that we're going to distribute to the regional newspapers and TV stations for our area that will kind of outline basic information, like the names of unincorporated areas and where those areas are, the names of our different celebrations so that they actually get those names right. We have different districts on our reservation that are different areas, our clan system and how it works. And that style book that we're going to implement that in our newsroom, and we're what we want to do is really kind of, I like to say, indigify our style in to set us apart, where we're not only identifying people by their name and where they're from, like Luella Bryn of Crow Agency. It would actually be Luella Bryn, member of the Big Lodge clan of the Reno district, blah, 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 Bryn, who grew up in Crow Agency. So it would really like pinpoint those things. That way people in our community know those familial relationships, because we have our blood relations and we have our clan relations. And that will not only set us apart as an Indigenous publication and give us really that Indigenous edge, it gives our community a sense of like, hey, these guys know what they're doing. It gives them a sense of ownership because they're Apsáalooke, and what we're doing is very extremely Apsáalooke. And that identity is so important. Having that sense of identity and that sense of culture, it's so important. And when younger people are reading that, and this kind of goes even beyond the idea of journalism, but when kids have that sense of identity and are connected to their culture, that raises self-esteem, and that decreases the chance of suicide, decreases depression, decreases all of these negative impacts in their lives. And if something that we can do that is simple can affect our community in that way, then we're definitely going to do it. One of our big hurdles, though, is funding. Just like every other small publisher in this entire country is funding. We are in a high poverty, low employment area. It's incredibly difficult to sit there and ask our community to become monthly donors when they have a hard time keeping their electricity on. So we really rely on grants. We really rely on people outside of our community to be our monthly donors. And so we need to give them a news product that is going to excite them. And I think having that cultural identity in our news product is the solution. Having that style book that we can share with the outside mainstream organizations is a good way to collaborate. We have partnerships with the Billings Gazette and KTVQ News, where we share content. They'll call us and ask if we have a phone number for someone. We'll call them. Hey, do you have a phone number for someone? If they come down, and they need like a tour guide on the reservation to help them find someone's house, like we'll help them out. So kind of bridging that gap for them is important, because I want them to have good coverage of my community. And if I can help them have good coverage of my community and help them kind of build those relationships, then that's going to be good for my community. Even if it's bad news, it's still going to be better coverage. And I think gone are the days of we're all in competition, and the collaboration days are here now. Every few months I have to scoop them just so that they know. But it's very collaborative. So I think that is an important strategy to have, is building collaborative relationships with the organizations that are around you that are open to it. We have a partnership with Montana Free Press in Helena, and they're going to send a reporter down to work with us this summer to do coverage in our community. And that's going to be a fun and exciting opportunity because the reporter they're sending down is someone I wanted to hire, but I didn't have the budget to hire her.
Wow.
So I'll get to work with her. I was essentially stalking her while she was in journalism school. And I was like, I need to get a grant so I can hire her. And then helped her get on at the Free Press. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, now I get to work with her. It's going to be exciting.
Those resources.
Yeah, so building up collaboration, having that style book, and just funding. We need better solutions for funding. I think Press Forward, Borealis, those are great programs. From what I'm hearing about Press Forward, I don't know yet. We don't have a Press Forward Montana yet. So, and I'm not about to volunteer as tribute to help get that started.
But, to the point, and I have to wrap us up, to the point about the funding, we're here because of Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, and we need more, right? Investment directly into community newsrooms, nonprofit newsrooms, ethnic media that is reflecting the communities that you serve, such as your organizations. And I really am grateful that I got to be in conversation with the three of you all today, and excited to do even more as we continue on throughout the year. And yeah, I just really wanted to appreciate you for your time and your brilliance that you shared on this morning, afternoon, depending on where you are based. So again, we have Damaso Reyes of NY Amsterdam News, Luella Breen of 4 Points Media, and Crystal Good of Black by God. And my name is Tia Oso. I'm the principal with ZEAL Cooperative, and this has been Infinite Patterns, a kaleidoscope podcast exploring the infinite perspectives, shaping and transforming the field of journalism, talking about strategies for dismantling systemic inequities in news coverage.